Hello, everyone. All right, now that you have hopefully a little bit of an idea where we're headed now with databases, let's start getting into some specifics. What we'll do is kind of walk you through these tools that these programming languages have to allow us to connect and to execute and to close and so on, and we talked about in the previous video. So let's get into a little bit of specifics. We'll talk about them a little bit in this video. And then in the next video, we'll actually get into some programs and show you how it's done. And again, when we're done with that, you will try, okay? And a lot of it's going to be cutting and pasting from my code to help you get it started. Like everything, the first time you do it might be a little bit tricky and you might fat finger some things and things don't work exactly as you plan. But once again, stay true to what I'm going to give you. Make sure everything looks correct and it should work perfectly for you, okay? Anyway, so database basics for programming. What we want to do in this particular, there we go. What we want to do in this particular video is talk about programmatically interfacing with a database. What do we do in this? How we do it in a program. We talked it from a high level in the previous video, but let's get down to some specifics a little bit. Then we're going to understand Microsoft's, the concept of Microsoft's OLE DB, which will allow us to connect and to execute and to read and to close and so on. Okay? That's kind of how it all works. Bear with me here and you'll see what I'm talking about, okay? What's kind of cool in today's programming languages is that just about every programming language now has the ability to help us connect, open, execute, and close from a database. Meaning we don't have to do too much. What we got to do is when we learn a new language, we got to ask that language, how do you connect, open, execute, and close in your language? We're going to show you how to do it in Microsoft and so on, but it's usually a bunch of inherent code. Usually it's in the form of a class, so you people who understand a little bit about object-oriented, they wrote objects, they wrote classes for us. These other languages did that we can actually utilize their methods, aka functions, to do the things that we need to do. Connect, execute, and so on, and close, okay? All we got to do in these functions is just pass the content of what we're trying to do. It could be, again, the specifics of a connection string. We'll talk about that a little bit. The actual query itself, the string, and so on. Those are the things we basically are going to utilize. So a lot of this stuff is written for us. All right. For example, if I sit back and we go out and we look at a couple things, here's PHP. So people who may take PHP in the future, this is under Web Programming 1 course. One of the things we'll get into is MySQL. It'll be a totally different database application versus SQL Server, but it's very similar. It's still relational. It's a relational database. It still has foreign keys and primary keys. And matter of fact, it looks identical to what you already know. That's the beautiful thing here. A lot of these things have similarities. There's minor differences, but not enough for you to worry about. Just enough that you can go explore and see what it actually works. MySQL usually works as an open source database, and it works with PHP. But when you get into PHP, look what it has. It actually has this thing called MySQL I. Now, you might look at this and say, no idea what you're talking about, Bob. All I want to tell you is it has things in here to show you how to connect to a database. What this is actually doing here is telling us what the server name is, where's the database located at, what the username and the password is, and all we're going to do is say new MySQL I, and put those parameters in there, and if it connects, it'll be good. If it doesn't connect, it would fail. You might look at that and say, still no idea. That's okay, but once you start playing around with what we're going to be doing the rest of this course, really after this week, this will make perfect sense for you. My goal in showing you this right here is that PHP does it the same way as we're going to be doing it in SQL, in VB.net. It's not using the same tools like MySQL. We're going to be using something called ADO.net. But what we will be doing is very similar things, connecting, executing, reading, and so on. They all do the same things. You just got to ask the questions on how once you get to the language. If you look at Java, Java has this thing called Java Database Connectivity, okay? So once again, it connects, it creates statements, it executes the statements, and so on. That's what Java does. So when you get into Java and you want to know how to connect to a database, it's JDBC. And you'll just ask the questions. Okay, JDBC, how do you connect to a database? How do you execute a query? How do you read the result sets? How do you close the database? You get the idea? So the steps that I've shown you in the previous video and we're talking about right now are the steps to access any database from any language. Your job will be to go to the language to figure out how to do it. But all you got to do is literally ask the questions. Almost like how you ask the questions, how do you do a loop in Java? How do you do a conditional statement in Java? And so on. How do you add? How do you subtract? Blah, 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 blah. How do you create variables? Once you know this kind of stuff, I've told you this before, once you know one language, you start knowing them all. That's the beauty of it all. You just start asking questions, how does this language do it? And it's the same thing for databases. All right? All right, let's get back to our piece here. And so I'll get started here. Boom, boom, boom. I won't leave you again. All right? So in Microsoft, they have something that's called OLE, Object Linking and Embedding. You might say, what the heck does that mean? Don't worry about it. It's their own little piece of software. Again, it's a class. We're going to be using their objects. It's going to allow us to connect, pass or retrieve data from the database, execute it, and close it. That's what we're going to be doing. It's fairly simple. The beautiful thing, once again, is it's consistent. There's one little nuance to it, and we'll talk about that here in a second, that you just need to understand on how you execute something, okay? But once you have this down, again, it's cutting and pasting. All you do is just keep changing the parameters, and you cut and paste as you go through it. Does that make sense? Okay, it's just that easy. But we're going to use the OLE DB. Microsoft has a couple of objects or classes, I should say, for databases. For this particular course, we're going to use OLE DB. They actually have a kind of a newer one, but it's actually a little bit more complex than we need to. OLE DB is very simple, and it will do exactly what we actually needed to do, okay, for what we're going to be doing right now, all right? And again, once you play around with it once or twice, you got it. All right. So understanding the connection string. So one of the things we're going to learn is all about a connection string. I have a link in here, and you can feel free to go ahead and connect on this link. It's for if you pull down the PowerPoint, connect on this link to learn about a connection string. Every programming language has this thing called a connection string. And it's a string, literally that basically creates parameters that talks about what the source name is, what the passwords are, what the security is, and so on. If you remember my 5 steps, we usually got to connect first, and then we got to open. Usually what you're doing in most programming languages is you're opening and connecting at the same time using this connection string. You'll hear this term connection string quite a bit. We'll create this connection string together. I'll show you that in the next video. Once you got it, you got it. Okay. Then on the next time you access a different database, you got to change the connection string. But for the most part, it's very similar. Okay. The connection string could change based upon the type of database you're going after. I mean, if you're doing SQL Server, you will tell it that versus you're going after Access or MySQL or so on. You'll tell it where it's located. You'll tell it any security parameters that it needs to know. And if it's going to be password protected, you'll give it that information too. It's all in this string, and it's all based upon that. It needs to be set up correctly because that's what the language is going to recognize. But it's actually pretty simple, okay? Again, every language does it a little bit different, but still the same criteria. So you'll ask the question, how do you create a connection string? Then what we have in OLDB is this thing called a connection object. The connection object represents a unique connection to the data source. So that would be your database, okay? The connection object uses the connection string to open the connection. As I said before, usually we combine those things when we're connecting and opening. The connection string has a state property that will actually state is it open or is it closed. The command object then, another object that's actually part of this OLE piece here, is what we'll be using to actually execute our queries. And as I said a little bit a second ago, there's this little nuance in this command that if you're going to execute a select, you'll be using execute reader. If you're going to execute a non-reading type of query, meaning a non-select, insert, delete, update, you'll use execute non-query. If I'm going pretty fast right now and you're going, oh my God, my head's spinning, just stay patient. Just kind of listen as best you can. And again, when I show you this, you'll say, oh, okay, now I understand. Okay? And my recommendation would be is once you see the code, maybe go back to this PowerPoint and make sure you see what all these different commands are doing or these objects are doing. Okay? Again, once you do them a few times, you got it. There's really no changing. If we actually read a select statement, we're going to use this thing called a data reader, and this will allow us to read through the result sets. If you remember from IT 111, we got a result set, and we just kind of looked at it. When programming, we just can't look at it. We got to get the result set, and we're going to loop through the result set. It almost becomes an array of rows, right, of what's returned. And so just like in an array where you would go through it, you're going to go through it a result set this way. Okay, it doesn't really contain to the index or anything. We don't worry about indexing I want to say looping through our result set. We're just going to go through it, and we're going to read one row at a time. We may process it. We might do conditional programming against it, or we might just take the result set and just display it. Okay, and so with that said, then you would keep reading until there are no more rows in the result set, and we do that with the data reader. Okay. That's kind of the main parts, okay? And again, every programming language has things very similar to this. And so once you kind of get used to it, you'll be able to ask those questions pretty neatly. So hopefully this is your first step. Now let's get into some specifics and look at a piece of code and get something working.